So now that we are recording, let us return to our discussion of how they generated this money to leverage the American economy, which is a huge economy.
After the Great Depression, the United States had 40 years of economic growth without a single financial crisis. The financial industry was tightly regulated. Most regular banks were local businesses, and they were prohibited from speculating with depositor savings. Investment banks, which handled stock and bond trading, were small private partnerships.
In the traditional investment banking partnership model, the partners put the money up. And obviously, the partners watched that money very carefully. They wanted to live well, but they didn't want to bet the ranch on anything.
Paul Volcker served in the Treasury Department and was chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979 to 1987. Before going into government, he was a financial economist at Chase Manhattan Bank.
Now, throughout the Keynesian era of economy, that is from the 1930s all the way up to 1980s, the government very tightly regulated the financial system. And for good reason, because the financial system, which used to be unregulated during the classical liberal era of the early 1900s, led to the Great Depression of 1929. The Great Depression led to severe social and economic dislocation, the rise of fascism in Europe, and ultimately the Second World War. So when the Second World War ended, the leaders of the victorious West were determined to avoid a repetition of such a disaster. So they tightly regulated the financial system. How did they regulate it? In the United States, the regulation took the form of carefully compartmentalizing the scope of activity for each type of bank. Now, essentially, you have two types of banks: savings and deposit banks, which collects ordinary people's money. Okay? So you are an ordinary working person. You save a little aside every month. And in order to earn interest from your savings, you put it in a bank. That's a savings and deposit bank. Mevduat Tasarruf Bankası. If you make a natural allegory, savings and deposit banks are like the whales in the oceans. You know, whales, hunchback whales, blue whales, huge but harmless. Not very agile, but, they nevertheless take up some space. So their movements are significant for the ecology of the oceans. But fortunately enough, they move very slowly and predictably. Then there is a second group of banks, the investment banks. These banks are private partnerships in the regulatory system of the American economy of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Investment banks, whose capital is endowed by a group of private individuals, engage in risky financial endeavors like stock trading. Okay, they go into the stock market, buy or sell stocks, and they finance very risky expeditionary investments in overseas countries or very risky trade deals and so on. Okay? But they are private partnerships, which means they cannot sell their own stock to ordinary people, and they cannot collect the savings of ordinary people. So if you are giving your money to an investment bank, that means, one, You are its partner. You are not its customer, you are its partner. Two, you know the risks. You can, çok yaşa, again, in our oceanic allegory, you can liken these investment banks to sharks. Right? They are like sharks, very aggressive, looking for food at every opportunity, biting everything they come across. But ultimately, compared to whales, they are small. And there aren't that many of them. So their actions, although unpredictable, are still not very consequential for the world or American economy. They cannot destroy the American economy or disrupt world trade. They are not large enough to do that. And the banks that are large enough to do that, well, they don't engage in such speculative financial activity. They are the savings and deposit banks. You see? Anladınız mı benzetmeyi arkadaşlar? Bir mevduat tasarruf bankaları var. Onlar balinalar. Yavaş hareket ediyorlar. Büyükler ama yavaş hareket ediyorlar. Tahmin edilebilir hareket. Bir de yatırım bankaları var. Köpek balıkları gibi onlar. Hızlı hareket ediyorlar, daha saldırgan ama küçükler. So this regulatory compartmentalization of the scope of activities of these banks made sure, one, these banks didn't threaten the national economy or disrupt global economy. Two, this also made sure that people working for them didn't make a fortune.
Chase to go to the Treasury.
So Paul Walker used to work as an economic advisor for Chase Manhattan, one of the largest investment banks in the United States and therefore the world. He went from Chase in 1963 to Treasury. Now, usually in the neoliberal era, it's the opposite, right? You don't go from Chase to Treasury. If you're a sane person, you go from the Treasury to Chase because you make, 10, 12, 20 times more in Chase. That wasn't the case in 1963. How much was Paul Walker making as a chief economic advisor of Chase Manhattan in 1963?
In 1969.
Sorry, 1969.
My income was in the neighborhood of $45,000.
45.
$45,000 a year. That's like $450,000 in today's terms. Now, as I said, today, a chief economic advisor to a bank like Chase makes 10 to 20 times more than that.
Morgan Stanley in 1972 had approximately 110 total personnel, one office, and capital of $12 million. Now, Morgan Stanley has 50,000 workers and has capital of several billion and has offices all over the world.
In the 1980s, the financial industry exploded.
So, predictably enough, it was the onset of the neoliberal era, the Reagan administration of the 1980s, that unleashed the banks, the financial industry.
The investment banks went public, giving huge amounts of stockholder money.
So the first thing they did was they allowed investment banks to sell their own stock to ordinary people. So private partnership became obsolete, which means from the stock market, investment banks started collecting money, which means they got bigger.
People on Wall Street started getting rich.
And of course, not surprisingly, people who worked for these banks got richer. Their owners, they got even more richer.
I had a friend who was a bond trader at Merrill Lynch in the 1970s. He had a job as a train conductor at night because he had 3 kids and couldn't support them and what a bond trader. By 1986, he was making millions of dollars and thought it was because he was smart.
My wife said, "You win, we'll fly to Asia. If I win, we'll fly to Paris. I bet you won't get some."
The highest order of business before the nation is to restore our economic prosperity.
In 1981, President Ronald Reagan chose as Treasury Secretary the CEO of the investment bank Merrill Lynch, Donald Regan.
Now, Don Regan is a key figure in the onset of the neoliberal era. As the former CEO of Merrill Lynch, he, by and large, formulated the so-called deregulation policy. Remember how the governments in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s kept the financial sector under control through regulation. Reagan believed that you need to relax the bureaucratic controls over the financial industry so that it can create more growth. Returning to our nuclear reactor allegory, Reagan and the neoliberals around him believed that you need to remove the control roles a little to increase reactivity so that the market, now less suppressed by the state, could generate more wealth. At what cost? Well, most of that wealth would go to the people who are already rich. But they said that doesn't matter, because even if it goes to people who are already rich, it will eventually trickle down from them to the rest of the economy. Also called trickle-down economics. This neoliberal agenda called for the deliberate relaxation of regulations that restrained further market growth.
And the president do see eye to eye. I've talked to many leaders last week. They all said behind the president 100%.
The Reagan administration, supported by economists and financial lobbyists, started a 30-year period of financial deregulation. In 1982,
So, starting with Ronald Reagan, progressively, investment banks acquired more and more room for maneuver.
the Reagan administration deregulated savings and loan companies, allowing them to make risky investments with their depositors' money. By the end of the decade, hundreds of savings and loan companies had failed.
One of the deregulations the Reagan administration did was to allow savings and loan companies. These are not banks. These are private partnerships that collect the savings of ordinary people. The Turkish translation is banker. We used to have them in Turkey. We don't have them anymore, of course. And why don't we have them? Well, because just like the United States, Turkey too had bankers, savings and loan companies, in the 1980s. The most famous of them was Banker Castelli. And like the ones in the United States, in Turkey too, by the end of 1980s, all savings and loan companies went bankrupt. Because a savings or loan company is essentially a company that collects ordinary people's savings and promises them higher than average interest rates in return. How do they pay the higher than average interest rate in return? Well, A, they must be really, really very, very smart to see investment opportunities that is not seen by the larger, more established banks. B, they may be building a Ponzi scheme, right? Paying the new, old investors with the money of the new investors until it pops. And indeed, that's what happened.
This cost taxpayers $124 billion and cost many people their life savings.
Now, every time a bubble bursts, every time a speculative bubble, a Ponzi scheme bursts, it costs the state to bail out some companies, to restore social order, to pay for compensations, and most importantly, in terms of reduced tax revenues and economic growth, unemployment, stagnation, bankruptcy, and so on. So the cost of the savings and loan companies crisis of the late 1980s was in the vicinity of $124 billion for the American economy. While considerable, it isn't a lot.
It may be the biggest bank heist in our history.
Thousands of savings and loan executives went to jail for looting their companies. One of the most extreme cases was Charles Keating.
Now, this is the Banker Castelli of the United States. Bizde Banker Castelli'nin oynadığı rolü Amerika'da Charles Keating oynuyor arkadaşlar. Ha. Sizin jenerasyona daha yakın örnek Jet Fadıl. Ha. Vallahi araba yapacağız falan diye milletin parasını toplayıp.
In 1985, when federal regulators began investigating, Keating hired an economist named Alan Greenspan.
So, of course, in the early 1980s, the regulatory bodies in the United States were still very strong. And by mid-1980s, they started looking into the very suspicious-looking activities of these savings and deposit companies, which looked a lot like a Ponzi scheme. So they looked at Charles Keating, one of the leading bankers of the era, and they said, what are you doing? So Keating hired a respectable economist called Alan Greenspan from the University of Harvard.
In this letter to regulators, Greenspan praised Keating's sound business plans and expertise.
And Alan Greenspan, the respected economist, assured the regulators, don't worry, he isn't building a Ponzi scheme. He's a very smart investor. He will return all investors' money with profit, as promised.
And said he saw no risk in allowing Keating to invest his customers' money. Keating reportedly paid Greenspan $40,000.
So, having received $40,000 for this report, Greenspan went on with his business. And so did Keating.
Charles Keating went to prison shortly afterwards. As for Alan Greenspan,
Now, when Keating went bankrupt and went to jail for looting his own company, what do you think happened to Alan Greenspan? You know, he had just vouched for a guy who turned out to be a criminal. You would guess that his prestige as an economist would be shattered, right? Not quite.
President Reagan appointed him chairman of America's central bank, the Federal Reserve.
They appointed him to chair the Federal Reserve because he, it so happened, was exactly the kind of economist they were looking for. The one that turned a blind eye to all the excesses of the market.
Greenspan was reappointed by Presidents Clinton and George W. Bush. During the Clinton administration, deregulation continued under Greenspan, and Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, the former CEO of the investment bank Goldman Sachs, and Larry Summers, a Harvard economics professor.
Now, by the time the Clinton administration came to power, the Soviet Union had collapsed, the Cold War was won, and globalization was in full swing. And the American financial sector rightly claimed to be the driver of the engine of globalization. And what they essentially said was this: we call the shots. And if you try to resist us politically, economically, militarily, we'll mow you down. And the democratic left in the American political system, just like the labor in Britain, bought in on this neoliberal agenda wholesale. Worm, hook and sinker, as the saying goes. Oltayı böyle olduğu gibi yutuyorlar. And declared that they no longer represent the old left, which benefited from class conflict and pro-labor policies, but they are now the new left, which appreciated the advantages of globalization. And Bill Clinton was the first and most successful example of this new left, flanked by Wall Street people. He came to power, and under a democratic administration, under a Democratic Party administration, proceeded with the neoliberal agenda in full swing.
Financial sector, Wall Street being powerful, having lobbyists, having lots of money, step by step capture the political system, both on the Democratic and the Republican side.
By the late 1990s, the financial sector had consolidated into a few gigantic firms, each of them so large that their failure could threaten the whole system. And the Clinton administration helped them grow even larger.
If you've ever opened 20 tabs on Google Scholar trying to figure out what the research says, watch this. Normally,
in 1998, Citicorp and Travelers merged to form Citigroup.
Now, throughout the 1990s, the financial sector continued to grow, and its influence over American politics continued to grow. And the reason is basically campaign financing. The American system is a multi-layered system from local to state to federal. And you practically have elections all the time, either at local, state, or federal level. And then on top of them, you have the presidential elections every 4 years. So if you want to run for office, you need money, a lot of money. And the banks happen to have a lot of money. So they financed the candidates on both aisles of the Congress. And because it is a two-party system, their job was very easy. There are only two parties. So there are only two candidates you need to finance, you see. They didn't finance one party's candidate against the other. They were too smart for that. They financed both candidates. Whoever won owed them. Now, the breaking point for the domination of finance in the United States came at the end of 1990s, in 1998. Okay? That's the year the Citigroup was established. The Citigroup emerged from the merger of Citibank and the Travelers Group. Now, Citibank was an investment bank. In our naval oceanic allegory, it was a shark. Travelers was a savings and deposit bank. In our oceanic allegory, a whale. What do you end up with if you merge a shark with a whale? A whale-sized shark. That is precisely the reason why the regulative economy of the 1970s, 1960s, the Keynesian economy, didn't allow the merger of these two types of banks under the same group. So if you operated an investment bank, you couldn't also own a savings and deposit bank.
Services company in the world. The merger violated the Glass-Steagall Act, a law passed after the Great Depression, which prevented banks with consumer deposits from engaging in risky investment banking activities.
It was illegal to acquire travelers. Greenspan said nothing. The Federal Reserve gave him an exemption for a year.
Of course, the American Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Alan Greenspan, didn't object to this. Because Greenspan was indeed exactly the kind of economist that neoliberal banking industry was looking for.
And then they got the more banks.
So the Federal Reserve, instead of suspending the activities of the Citigroup until they abided by the law, as should be the case, if a bank is illegal, it is the job of the Federal Bank and the Ministry of Economics, the Ministry of Finance, to suspend its activities, suspend its license, right? Bankanız yasa dışıysa Maliye Bakanlığı lisansınızı iptal eder, değil mi? They didn't. Instead, they gave them a year's exemption until they forced the US Congress to produce a bill that would make the merger legal. So instead of forcing the bank to abide by the law, they made sure that the law abided by the bank. Bankayı kanuna uydurmak yerine kanunu bankaya uyduruyor.
At the urging of Summers and Rubin, Congress passed the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, known to some as the Citigroup Relief Act. It overturned Glass-Steagall and cleared the way for future mergers.
Why do you have big banks? Well, because
Well, Willem Boutier, the chief economist of the Citigroup, is remarkably blunt and open for a man of his stature speaking to this documentary. He says, why do banks want to grow bigger? Well, because banks like monopoly power and lobbying power.
banks like monopoly power, because banks like lobbying power, because banks, when they're too big, they will be bailed.
So with this merger, not only did we have an outsized bank which engaged in very risky activities, but we also had the first example of what is called too big to fail. It was so large, this bank, the Citigroup, the largest financial services group in the world, that if it somehow failed, it would take the American economy with it and disrupt global economy, which means the American government, as well as other governments, would be forced to save it, bail it out. Now, simultaneously, this bank also was allowed to engage in all sorts of risky investment activities. So it was at the same time too big to fail and more likely to fail. Okay? There is the movie The Deep Blue Sea, if you had ever watched it. A group of scientists who tried to create a neurologic drug that would cure Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Experiment with tiger sharks. But the tiger shark's original brain is not large enough to produce the hormones, the pheromones, at the desired concentration and amount. So they genetically re-engineered tiger sharks to reach 30 meters in length and 20 tons in weight with very large brains. And then, of course, as you may guess, the sharks escape. Now, what does a 30-meter shark want? A 30-meter shark with the intelligence of a gorilla. What? It wants food, right? It sails, it swims into the deep blue sea in search of more food.
Even the unstable.
This is George Soros, one of the gurus of international investment, who very calmly, as a matter of fact, says markets are inherently unstable.
Is potentially unstable. And appropriate metaphor is the oil tankers. They're very big. And therefore, you have to put in compartments to prevent the sloshing around of oil from capsizing the boat. The design of the boat has to take that into account. And after the Depression, the regulations actually introduced this very kind of watertight compartments. And deregulation has led to the end of compartmentalization.
The next crisis came at the end of the 90s. The investment banks fueled a massive bubble in internet stocks, which was followed by a crash in 2001.
So the first crash of the deregulation era was the savings and deposit companies that defrauded their customers by creating a Ponzi scheme at the end of 1980s. The second crash came with the so-called dot-com bubble. The dot-com bubble referring to the newly emerging internet companies in the late 1990s with the advent of the information era. When these internet companies first came around, investment banks claimed that they are the future and they will reshape economy, and their early investors will become filthy rich if they buy in on their investments early on. Of course, the dot-com companies did reshape global capitalism. They did generate huge profits, but not immediately, you see, and not all of them. Of the hundreds of dot-com companies that emerged in the 1990s, only a few are the ones that you know today, like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Yahoo, and so on. The overwhelming majority couldn't produce enough value to justify the investments and went bankrupt. Is this familiar to you in any way? It's happening right now, actually. We are experiencing the dot-com bubble of our era right now. the AI companies. They are the current dot-com bubble. Because people are telling investors, $2 trillion, $3 trillion, they will reshape the world, they will reshape the labor market. Yes, they will, but they won't do it next quarter, you see, or next year. They'll do it in 10 years now. We need additional technologies, adaptation of infrastructure, and most importantly, adaptation of the society for them to deliver the promised returns. They can't deliver them right now. You see? So what will happen to the people who are investing in them right now? A very few of them will get rich eventually. You know, like the cleaning lady of Facebook. When Facebook first set up its office, they didn't have much money. They had this cleaning lady who came in and, you know, swept the floors, tidied the desks and everything. And because they didn't have money, they gave her a small share of the company, like 1% of Facebook. Can you calculate 1% of Facebook right now? Yeah. So eventually some cleaning lady will be a dollar millionaire, but the majority of the investors will go bankrupt. That's what happened with the dot-com companies in the 1990s.
$1 trillion in investment losses.
And the investment losses reached $5 trillion. That was the first major crisis that shook global capitalism.
The Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal agency which had been created during the Depression to regulate investment banking, had done nothing.
In the absence of meaningful federal action, and there has been none, and given the clear failure of self-regulation, it has become necessary for others to step in.
Now, because, you know, in the first crisis, the regulatory bodies did their job. They looked at the savings and deposit companies. They scrutinized them for their suspicious Ponzi scheme activities. And when they failed, they jailed everybody. Okay? Charles Keating went to jail for defrauding his customers. Now, by the end of the 1990s, the banks were so powerful and the regulative bodies had become so emancipated that the Securities and Exchange Commission, bizdeki Sermaye Piyasası Denetleme Kurulu'nun karşılığı SPDK'nın, had done nothing when they caused a $5 trillion crisis. So it was up to the Attorney General of New York, where the Wall Street is situated, to step in and try to hold these people accountable.
Protections needed.
Elliot Spitzer's investigation revealed that the investment banks had promoted internet companies they knew would fail. Stock analysts were being paid based on how much business they brought in, and what they said publicly was quite different from what they said privately.
As I said, if you had a training in economics worth the name, you only look, you know, with a very short glance at the Excel tables and the graphics to understand whether what you're seeing is a Ponzi scheme or not. The only thing you need is this. 3 items really. How much money is coming in terms of investment? How much expenditure do we have? And how much revenue are we generating? If the revenues are not even close to covering the expenditures, if the bulk of expenditures is being covered with investor money. And if this is likely to be in the foreseeable future, that's a Ponzi scheme. Okay? Simple. A good investment requires reasonable amounts of capital that returns high profits at a reasonable amount of time. Makul miktarda parayla makul bir sürede maksimum karı elde ettiğin şeye iyi yatırım denilir arkadaşlar. If you have a flood of investments, a ton of expenditure, but no revenue, that's a Ponzi scheme, right? And of course, the traders who sold these internet companies, the stocks of internet companies, to their customers, they knew these companies were not in a position to return the investment in the foreseeable future. The infrastructure necessary was not there. We had the dot-com bubble in Turkey, you know. It was the height of, you know, private telecom and internet, but you see, we had dial-up internet at the time. You don't even know what dial-up internet, don't you? The copper cables in the landlines, which you don't use anymore, the internet traffic used to travel over them. Bakır kablo üzerinden gidiyor arkadaşlar. İnternet trafiği. Hani böyle falan diye ses yapan garip garip şeyler var ya. At a pathetic speed. So how can you set up e-commerce? The customer is supposed to see what they are buying, which means you will have to relay video over that copper cable. It is technically not possible. You cannot watch a video over a copper cable, okay? Not in the volumes of traffic envisaged by e-commerce. Not to mention the interfaces. There is no social media. You only have websites. There is no smartphone. There are no tablets. You have to use computers. The laptops are like luggage. So you have to actually sit down in front of a computer, open the browser, search for the website, get into the website, click on the products individually. And you can't even see a video of them. And you're expected to buy shoes, telephones, refrigerators, TV sets under these conditions. A friend of mine was leading an electronics company established by a very large group of the time. And these ambitious people, they wanted, you know, we will be the market leader in this. So they told him to prepare a report. And he was 27, so like myself at the time, he used to say stuff that would put him into trouble to his bosses. And to his bosses, he said, do you know the gold rush of the 19th century in the United States? They said, yes. Okay. You know who made the most money from the gold rush? Not the people who went searching for gold, but the people who sold the equipment, the tents and food to the people who went to search for gold. Altın ucundan altın arayanlar değil, onlara kazma kürek ve çadır satanlar en çok parayı kazandı arkadaşlar. So he said, forget about e-commerce. We should invest in infrastructure. The company that benefited the most from this was the companies that benefited from the most from this were the telecom companies. You see, while everybody was trying to sell something online. So these people, they knew these dot-com companies were going to fail. And they sold them as a solid investment to their customers anyway.
Given the highest possible rating, dismissed by an analyst as a piece of junk.
And in their private conversations, they were admitting to each other that the companies they were selling were a piece of junk. Do you know a dot-com company called Excite? You don't. Not surprising, because it went bankrupt in 1999 after failing to deliver any returns to its investors. All the AI companies that mushroom around you, with the exception of companies like ChatGPT's OpenAI, or maybe Claude or Gemini, the rest you won't even remember in a few years' time. They will all go bankrupt, failing to deliver to their investors.
Sign, also highly rated, called such a piece of crap.
So these people,
The defense
amongst themselves, they were referring to these companies as piece of crap. And to their customers, they were selling them as good investment. Buy their stock. You will make money. And what was the defense? This is interesting. Elliot Spitzer, the Attorney General of New York, who prosecuted these people, received their depositions, of course, when he prosecuted them. Savcı ifadelerini alıyor. Ne yaptınız oğlum siz dolandırıcılık diye? Savunma ne olabilir sizce? What is the defense, you know?
that was proffered by many of the investment banks was not, you're wrong. It was, everybody's doing it and everybody knows what's going on, and therefore nobody should rely on these analysts anymore.
The answer was not, no, we weren't defrauding our customers. The answer was, everybody's doing it. Everybody knows it's a fraud. You shouldn't rely on our analysis and make buying decisions based on our word. Everybody knows we are crooks. Herkes dolandırıcı olduğumuzu biliyor oğlum. Bizim lafımızla niye alışveriş yapıyorsunuz?
In December of 2002, 10 investment banks settled the case for a total of $1.4 billion and promised to change their ways.
So ultimately, Elliot Spitzer's case of dot-com fraud ended in a $1 billion settlement. The banks paid Spitzer's plaintiffs a total of $1.4 billion in compensation. And they promised they won't do it again. You think? Vallahi bir daha yapmayacağım söz. 30 metrelik köpek balığı adamın kolunu koparmış. Pardon insanmış ya, ben seni çok zannettim. Vallahi bir daha yemeyeceğim senden söz. Al bak kolum.
Scott Talbot is the chief lobbyist for the Financial Services Roundtable, one of the most powerful groups in Washington, which represents nearly all of the world's largest financial companies.
Are you comfortable with the fact that several of your member companies have engaged in large-scale criminal activity?
You have to be specific.
Okay,
First of all, criminal activity shouldn't be accepted, period.
Since deregulation began, the world's biggest financial firms have been caught laundering money. defrauding customers, and cooking their books again and again and again. Credit Suisse helped funnel money for Iran's nuclear program and for the Aerospace Industries Organization of Iran, which builds ballistic missiles.
Any information that would identify as Iranian would be removed.
The bank was fined $536 million. Citibank helped funnel $100 million of drug money out of Mexico.
Did you comment that she should, quote, lose any documents connected with the account?
I said that in a kidding manner, it was the early stages of this, I did not get serious.
Between 1998 and 2003, Fannie Mae overstated its earnings by more than $10 billion.
These accounting standards are highly complex and require determinations over which experts often disagree.
CEO Franklin Rain, who used to be President Clinton's budget director, received over $52 million in bonuses. When UBS was caught helping wealthy Americans evade taxes, they refused to cooperate with the U.S. government.
We should be willing to apply to them.
If there's a treaty framework,
Don't do the treaty for, you agreed to participate in a fraud.
While the company faced unprecedented fines, the investment firms do not have to admit any wrongdoing.
When you're this large, when you're dealing with this many products and customers, mistakes happen.
Do you think it was a mistake? No mistake of such regularity and scope can be called a mistake. It's intentional. Why? Simple, because one, they know they will not have to admit to legal wrongdoing, which means they will be fined, they will pay to settle these cases, but their licenses will be unimpeded so that they can continue to do similar things, making more money, and when they get caught, or if they get caught, pay a fraction of their profits as settlement money and do it again and again and again.
The financial services industry seems to have a level of criminality that is, somewhat distinctive. When was the last time they issued a
Well, obviously, I had just sport, right? Yes.
Proposal to regulate derivatives.
financial system?
Using since the reserves express high-tech value generation and the income derives from actually creating something new and different. Beginning in the 1990s, deregulation and advances in technology led to an explosion of complex financial products called derivatives.
Now, we had said that these companies, they need more money. They need more food. They are whale-sized sharks. And the financial markets of the time are too shallow. So they need to create debt. And in order to deepen the financial markets, they need new products. And they create these products by derivation. Türev. Türev yatırım araçları. What is derivation?
Economists and bankers claim they made markets safer, but instead they made them unstable.
and code for businesses that management to unify their skills, not on code or technology, but on financial markets. And together with investment bankers, they create different methods to, as one of the, weapons of mass destruction.
Regulators, politicians, and business people did not take seriously the right of financial innovation on the stability of the financial system.
Using derivatives, bankers could gamble on virtually anything. They could bet on the rise and fall of oil prices, the bankruptcy of a company, even the weather. By the late 1990s, derivatives were a $50 trillion unregulated market.
Now, what is a derivative? Türev yatırım ne abi? Now, a regular or normal or a direct investment is this. I'm going to build a factory that produces smartphones, and I will compete in the Turkish market with foreign brands. Okay, I go to a bank and I say, I have this manufacturing group in electronics. Here are my credentials. I'm not yet father, I'm actually legit, like Vestel or something, or Archie. And I want money, right? Sustu. Şey olabilir. Exactly fine. Dans. Tamam. Okay. So I'm a legitimate manufacturing group willing to invest in the manufacture of cell phones. And I have my stock, I have my capital, I have my workforce, I have my infrastructure. So I want to draw credit from your bank. And your bank lends me the money and says, okay, I'll pay 10%, sorry, you'll pay 10% interest on an annual basis. So for a 10% interest on an annual basis, I get the credit. What is the end goal here? I'm going to invest the money in productive facilities, produce cell phones, market them in Turkey. Hopefully it's going to stick there, people will like my cell phones. And I will be able to do so profitably. That is, I will earn more money from my revenues than my costs, so that I can pay my workers, I can pay the raw materials, I can pay my energy bills, I can pay my taxes, and of course, I can pay my credit installments. That's a direct investment, okay? The bank finances my investment. Now, a derivative is this. You see, this company, let's call it Mehmet Tel, because I'm an investor. This company, Mehmet Tel, they're investing in local cell phone production. Okay. And our group is actually financing it. Okay, good luck. Here's what I tell you. If Mehmet Tel succeeds, its stock is going to go up. Right? Okay. And it will go up by like 30%. Yeah. Would you like to buy in on it? I'll sell you this derivative investment, assuming a 20% increase in Mehmet Tel's stock. So if Mehmet Tel's stock goes up, I'll pay you 20%, I'll pay you 15%. Right? Because it will go up 20%, I'll keep 5% for myself, and I'll pay you 15% in bonus, in profit. Right? Okay. Now, what if Mehmet Tel fails? Am I going to lose my money? No, don't worry. I've lent them the money. I know their credentials. I know their collaterals. If they fail, I'll pay you 10%. Because if they fail, they will still be able to pay me back my original credit. You see? And from that credit, I can pay you the 10% because it's a 10% interest rate credit. So for you, the derivative investor, Mehmet Tan's investment in local telephone production is a risk-free investment through the derivation. If Mehmet Tan succeeds, you get 15%. If it fails, you get 10%. What do you want? Al belanı mı istiyorsun? Daha ne istiyorsun? Öyle bir yatırım aracı düşün ki doğrudan yatırım başarılı olursa %15 kazanıyorsun, başarısız olursa %10 kazanıyorsun. Daha ne istiyorsun Allah'tan belanı mı? So these people who created the derivatives, they claimed we have found the fountain of youth, the magic pill, the undying unicorn. You know, we did it. We solved the problem of economic crisis. No one will ever lose money in the financial markets ever again. So, in a very short time, by the end of 1990s, this derivative market reached the volume of $50 trillion. Now, remember our original question. What was our original question? How the hell did they put together the money, the amount necessary to leverage the $16 trillion US economy? Because, remember, you would need at least $100 trillion to leverage a $16 trillion economy. Well, that's $50 trillion.
In 1998, someone tried to regulate them. Brooks Lee Bourne graduated first in her class at Stanford Law School.
Now, Brooks Lee Bourne was the embodiment of unfair competition. Haksız rekabetin vücut bulmuş hali kadın. She was a pioneering jurist. A public servant of impeccable record, and an exemplary, case for feminist emancipation.
And was the first woman to edit a major law review. After running the derivatives practice at Arnold & Porter, Bourne was appointed by President Clinton to chair the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which oversaw the derivatives market.
So when Bourne was appointed to chair the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which oversaw the derivative market, the decision by Clinton was welcomed by the public because Brooks Lee Bourne was such an exemplary figure. But do you think financial markets like people like this? They don't, you see. They like people like Alan Greenspan.
Brooks Lee Bourne asked me if I would come work with her. We decided that this was a serious, potentially destabilizing market.
In May of 1998, the CFTC issued a proposal to regulate derivatives. Clinton's Treasury Department had an immediate response.
Bourne looked at the derivatives market and immediately saw the ticking clock. Because the derivatives mechanism turned success from individual or local to global, which meant it also turned failure from individual or local to global. it created a system which didn't fail piecemeal. It succeeded globally. Therefore, when it collapsed, it would collapse globally as well. Because how did you make sure the investors at the individual level didn't lose money? Well, very simple. You connected one investment to the other, and then to the other, and then to the other. You connected all investments to each other through derivation. So this means if a big enough investment failed, everybody would fail. I mean everybody. And Bourne immediately saw that. Why? Because she was Brooks Lee Bourne. So she acted to regulate the derivatives. The Treasury Department was headed by Larry Summers, a Harvard economist like Alan Greenspan.
Go into Brooks Lee's office, and she was just putting down the receiver on her telephone, and the blood had drained from her face. And she looked at me and said, "That was Larry Summers. He had 13 bankers in his office." He conveyed it in a very bullying fashion, sort of directing her to stop.
The banks were now heavily reliant for doing some of these types of activity. And that led to a titanic battle to prevent this set of instruments from being regulated.
Shortly after the phone call from Summers, Greenspan, Rubin, and SEC Chairman Arthur Levitt issued a joint statement condemning Bourne and recommended legislation to keep derivatives unregulated.
Regulation of derivatives transactions that are privately negotiated by professionals is unnecessary.
No rule, unfortunately, first by the Clinton administration and then by the Congress. In 2000, Senator Phil Gramm took a major role in getting a bill passed that pretty much exempted derivatives from regulation.
They are unifying markets, they're reducing regulatory burden. I believe that we need to do it.
Why are we regulating something that already regulates itself? Senator Graham argued. It regulates itself. Why are we regulating it?
It is our very great hope that it will be possible to move this year on legislation that in a suitable way goes to create legal certainty for OTC derivatives.
I wish to associate myself with all of our Secretary Summers.
In December of 2000, Congress passed the Commodity Futures Modernization Act. Written with the help of financial industry lobbyists, it banned the regulation of derivatives.
So, just like with the merger of the Travelers Group with Citibank, regulation of derivatives was also banned by legal action. So the Congress, which allowed the Citigroup to emerge legally, also legalized the derivatives. Why? Well, because finance at this point had taken over American politics.
That was done, it was off to the races. And the use of derivatives and financial innovation exploded dramatically after 2000.
And it was just then that the Bush administration came to power. and it was off to the races. Now, let's tie this all to what we discussed so far about 9/11, the invasion of Iraq, and the Bush administration's policies. When was the last time the price of oil increased several fold in modern history before this one? We discussed it repeatedly in this course. It was the 1973 OPEC oil embargo after the Yom Kippur War between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Remember? When OPEC countries, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, placed an embargo on those Western countries and companies that had supported Israel during the Yom Kippur War, the price of oil increased from $3 to $7 and then to $11 and continued to rise throughout the 1970s until by 1979, the dual effect of the Iranian Islamic Revolution and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan pumped it all the way up to $39 a barrel. Okay? Remember what this rapid increase in oil prices had created. Oil producing countries and oil distributing companies were awash with petrodollars. And they had delivered this money to banks. So the banks, in turn, lent this money to third world countries in the form of sovereign debt. Remember? So by 1980s, when the oil price came down again, the banks turned to the third world countries and asked for their money, which triggered the third world debt crisis. Okay? The arrival of the Bush government and the oil price hike resulting from their policies was the second time such amounts of petrodollars were generated in the system since the OPEC oil crisis of the 1970s. And like in the first time, this money, the bulk of this money, went to the investment banks. They were awash with trillions of dollars of oil money, not to mention hundreds of billions of dollars of defense industry money, which was also benefiting massively from the ongoing war in the Middle East. And what did the depositors of this money want from the investment banks? Earn interest. Why do you deposit your money into a bank to begin with? Not to keep it safe, I guess. I mean, if you're Lockheed Martin. So the investment banks, now more powerful, commanding the deeper and global financial market, had trillions of dollars of money in their hands. And with this money, they created a derivative investment scheme that would be global in scale and leverage the American economy. But since it's almost 3 o'clock, let's leave this discussion for our next session. Okay, I am now ending our recording.